Tuckahoe Library present The Revolutionary War in Eastchester with Madeline Schaffer of the Eastchester Historical Society. The program is hosted by Liz Leckie.
Our speaker today, who is Mrs. Madeline Schaffer. I'm sure many of you already know Mrs. Schaffer, and you may have heard her speak. She's the president of the Eastchester Historical Society and was for many years a teacher at Main Street School, at the Cottle School, and was also a librarian at the Cottle School. Mrs. Schaffer has also consented to be one of the panelists at our final program on April 19th, which will be Tuckahoe History Night. And I want to thank her as well as the Eastchester Historical Society for their help to the Tuckahoe History Committee. They have lent two very important items to our show today. One is the oil painting of the Tuckahoe Quarry, which is over by the librarian's desk, and the other is the map of the town of Eastchester, which you see on the first panel as you come in to begin looking at the show. And the Historical Society has been a great help to the Tuckahoe Library in the past in lending us photos from their excellent collection to be copied, and I hope someday we'll be able to do the same for you. Thank you very much. Oh, I should say Mrs. Schaffer's program this afternoon is going to be the Revolutionary War in the town of Eastchester.
Thank you. They were the ones who would go break into your home and would take your animals, your cows and all of the animals that you had. You'd steal them, they would kill them, and they would use them for food. The skinners were the ones who would come and would steal your clothing, which of course was very, very scarce in those days, and they would also steal all of your valuables, anything that you had in the house, money, jewels, anything at all. They were just very, very lawless group. Almost without exception, they were the worthless and criminal element of the neighborhood in which they operated, who knew the coming and going of the men in the community. They prowled around at night in groups of 3 to 6 and would surprise the family, demand the last morsel and the last dollar, and if it were not quickly produced, would resort to maltreatment and torture to force the victim to reveal the hiding place of the few valuables that they still possessed. The steadily decreasing number of inhabitants were helpless against these attacks, which not only deprived them of their small possessions, but left the bruised and often maimed members of the family, not only without a place to lay their heads, but without the scantest of provisions for the following day. No one was safe, and one after another the dilapidated houses became vacant, and the farms overgrown with weeds. It was also the battleground of the main armies on both sides. For all those years, there wasn't a day when the organized armies were not within striking distance of each other. It became a no-man's land, the neutral ground, where the highways were unoccupied and the travelers walked through byways and the inhabitants of the villages ceased. The first blood was shed in the county in 1776 and the last in 1783. Today, very little is left of the pre-Revolutionary War buildings in the area known as the neutral ground. And the neutral ground extended from West Farms in the Bronx to Mamaroneck and Dobbs Ferry in the north. It is a wonder that we still have a few buildings left to visually remind us of our heritage after so much destruction in the area. In other words, in those days, Eastchester extended all the way from Scarsdale line down into what is now Co-op City. The population was about 400 persons. Most of the homes were unpretentious farmhouses such as this, the Hunt House. Standing in Mount Vernon on the Cross County Parkway until some years ago when vandals burned it down, it was one of the few pre-revolutionary buildings still left in our area, and it's one of the best examples of a farmhouse. You can see what a pretty place it was. This is some of the inside of it. Even before before the guns sounded at Lexington and Concord, the residents here had been under the fire of the Battle of the Pamphlets. The power of the clergy in those days was very strong, and chief among the Loyalist sympathizers was the author of a pamphlet called A Westchester Farmer. While both parties admitted that the laws of the colonies were unjust, there was a tremendous variance in how to remedy the situation. The First Continental Congress adjourned on October 26, 1774, and 4 weeks later there came from the press of John Rivington in New York a pamphlet signed at the end by A.W. Farmer. This was the first in a series and explained the problems facing the colonies, but advocated that remedies be sought through the existing colonial government. The author of this and other farmer pamphlets is conceded to be either the Reverend Samuel Seabury, then the rector of St. Paul's Church, which you see here in this slide, Eastchester, and later to become the first Episcopal bishop after the war, or the Reverend Isaac Wilkins, the first minister at St. Paul's after the Revolution. Thus, from the very start, Eastchester and her inhabitants were embroiled in what was to become a long, bloody war, not only against England, but also between families and fathers and sons. The choice of which side to support was not an easy one. Loyalties to the ties of England were strong. But those who had built a new life here wanted to live it their free way. Even our town records in Eastchester reflect the uncertainty of the times and the outcome of what the war would bring. In the bound minute book, there are 6 blank pages that cover the Revolutionary period. Obviously, there was not only not time to meet, but because of the conflict of interest, no one wanted to have written down at the beginning which side they chose. In March of 1775, 12 men, including 4 from Eastchester, met to take the sense of the freeholders of the county to choose delegates to the Second Continental Congress. That day, both sides held meetings, the Loyalists showing more strength than the Patriots. Now, these are, the 3 slides that I've just showed you are of St. Paul's, and I'm sure you all know now that St. Paul's Church, Eastchester, which now, of course, is in Mount Vernon, is now a national shrine. It belongs to the federal government, and you can go down there now on a regular basis from Monday through Friday, and also they have a museum connected with the church now, which is very interesting. They have a printing press there, which Maybelle Callender, who is here today, worked very hard with the day of the opening of the museum. And our society, of course, were very instrumental in getting this church and the cemetery taken over by the federal government. I beg your pardon? Yeah, the last one. All right, just a second now. It's a little bit difficult. I don't know. Guess I'm not doing any better, huh? Any better? Guess the slide. It's not any better, huh? I'm sorry. This next is a very dim slide anyway, because it's a very old one. Delegates were elected by a small group to go to Philadelphia. In May, this Congress authorized a militia to be raised in Westchester, of which 1 troop was to be in Eastchester. But all was not smooth, as the organization of the units was hampered by bitter disappointment and opposition among the rank and file when they learned that their officers were not to be of their own choosing. The militia here in Eastchester held their meeting at this house, which is the Fowler House. And it was located on the corner of Sanford Boulevard and Fulton Avenue. All of these, of course, are near the area near St. Paul's Church. And remember, when we're talking about Eastchester in this program, we are talking about Eastchester here also, but also down as far as St. with partisans of Colonel Drake supporting the candidacy of Mr. Fowler for the local militia, and this is a picture of a local militiaman. This house, long since demolished, was for many years a local landmark. Worse than the dissension in the militia was the growing feeling that open war could not be avoided. The tension in the area was high. As men finally had to take sides, Stephen Ward, the supervisor of the town of Eastchester, and his son chose the American side. Stephen's brother, Edmund Ward, chose the British side, with his son serving as a British officer. Judge Jonathan Fowler chose to be a loyalist, while 3 of his sons joined the American Army. It is now the summer of 1776. The bell from the steeple of St. Paul's Church has been buried on the grounds of this house, which is the Vincent Halsey House, to prevent its being melted down and cast into bullets. For safekeeping, too, the Bible and the prayer book are buried on these grounds. Later, by the way, this house, part of which is still standing, was the temporary capital of the United States. During the presidency of John Adams, there was a yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, which was the capital at the time. And John Adams' son-in-law, Colonel Smith, and his wife lived in this house. And John Adams and his family came up and lived here, and actually for several months this was the capital of the United States. And there's an interesting aside to this, that Mrs. Adams was very, very unhappy here, because she just felt that this kind of living way out in the country, kind of in no man's land, was much, much below her standing, and she was very unhappy and couldn't wait to leave. And at the time of the Revolution, this house was owned by the Vincent family. Gilbert Vincent, a very devout man, was approached by an American officer on a Sunday to shoe his horse. Refusing on religious grounds, the officer struck Gilbert with his sword and killed him. Gilbert's brother Elijah was so enraged that he took a commission with the British and became the terror of American officers in the area. In October of 1776, a large British force consisting of several thousand Hessians under General, this is another picture of the house, and this is a picture of what the house looks like today.
Where is this house?
Quite different. This house is on 233rd and Provost Avenue, down in the Bronx, and this is what's left of this beautiful old house. It's sad, really. In October of 1776, a large British force consisting of several thousand Hessians under General Knyphausen landed on Rodman's Neck in Pelham in hot pursuit of General Washington's troops, who were in ragged retreat after their disastrous defeat in Long Island. Ruin faced the Americans should this British force catch up with Washington to attack their flank or to block their escape. Because remember, at this point, George Washington was getting ready for the Battle of White Plains. To Colonel John Glover was given the task of delaying the advance of the Hessians until Washington could effect his escape. Colonel Glover and his 6 regiments camped on a knoll north of St. Paul's, and they watched the British as they disembarked. Glover then marched his men southward across the village green, which was in front of St. Paul's Church, and the salt marshes, and this is a picture of the salt marshes, into what is now Pelham. Deploying his groups against the trees and stones all along the sides of the road, he was able to inflict terrible casualties among the Hessians and to delay them appreciably. Now, just as a little aside to this, these salt meadows, previous to the settlement of Eastchester in 1664, Anne Hutchinson and her followers had settled in the Upper Bronx, but as we know, were unfortunately murdered by the Indians. The first sight that probably greeted her when she arrived here were these salt meadows, which until the coming of Co-op City have stretched along Eastchester Creek, which is what the lower end of the Hutchinson River is called. These meadows were of great importance to the early settlers, and indeed all the early records show that each received his fair share of the meadows so that they could all have fodder for their cattle. Now, General Kniphausen hurried on to White Plains, leaving all these wounded Hessian mercenaries in the unfinished St. Paul's Church. The present building, which had been started in 1765, offered poor protection from the elements. To keep warm, these Hessian soldiers knocked down the old frame church nearby, which had been erected in 1692, and built fires on the earthen floor. To make the place more habitable, they cut down trees and lined the trunks against the stone walls for benches. Due to exposure and improper medical care, perhaps almost 100 of these unfortunate Hessians died. Their bodies were crudely and hastily buried in an open sand pit, which had been previously opened to provide building sand for the erection of the church. Unfortunately, you can't do very much with this slide because the printing on the stone at this particular time is very, very worn. This stone is marks the grave at the rear of St. Paul's Cemetery, which all of these Hessian soldiers were buried in this common grave. And on the gravestone, it says that this is in memory of those Hessian soldiers who were killed at that particular time. Now, Philemon Fowler, who was a small boy at that time, told and retold many times after the war about standing in the doorway of St. Paul's and seeing the suffering and the privation undergone by these mercenaries. This is a very poor slide, but this is Fowler's tavern. Philemon Fowler, by the way, was a descendant of the founding families of Eastchester. After the war, he kept a tavern, the picture which you just saw, at the intersection of South 3rd Avenue and Columbus Avenue in Mount Vernon. Here, all the town meetings were held for many years. He was a very active citizen, and for 50 years held one town office or another. He was an ardent and active supporter of St. Paul's Church, and one of the founders of the first Masonic Lodge in Westchester in 1796. And you can see on this tombstone the insignia of the Masonic Lodge. His gravestone reflects his Masonic membership. This building, which I showed you in the previous slide, was demolished for construction of the Boston and Westchester Railroad about 1909. Now we come up here into Eastchester, and we come up to the Red House, which I'm sure many of you people have passed many, many times, but never knew what it was. The Red House is the house if you at the end of Stewart Avenue. Now, if you go past Eastchester High School, and you know there is a light at the intersection of White Plains Road and Stewart Avenue. If you turn right at that light, right ahead of you at the end of that street is this little red house. During this period, both the British and the Hessian forces camped around the houses in the area. And this red house, we call it the Red House because it is painted red, it's now lived in by a Mrs. Donahue, Rosemary Donahue, and she has kept the house just as it was, more or less. All the old beams are there, and the outside of the house, right, this is the entrance to the house here, and right across from that is just a field, and she has never tried to do anything to it, so it really looks just exactly really like it looked during the Revolutionary War. The fireplace in here was big enough to roast an ox. Now, during the Revolutionary War, this house was occupied by both sides, both the British and the Americans. And the Hessian forces particularly were around this area. It's typical of the houses at this time. And this house, by the way, also was the house of the shroud maker. Now, in those days, clothes were very, very scarce. And when people died, they did not bury them in their clothes, but they buried them in shrouds, which were something, really nothing more than a sheet with just a place for your head, a hole for your head and for your arms. And to go along with the value of clothing, I tell you this little story. The loose system of guards and the careless patrols of the British tempted the Americans, who were then marching northwards, to make raids on the outposts that would be coming up along what is now Route 22. One of these, made from the American marching column, was on a Hessian outpost in the neighborhood of Morell's Tavern, which stood on the bend of the White Plains Road, just south of the Free Synagogue. In other words, just where you would make the cutoff to go either up the Post Road or to go right onto California Road. Late in the afternoon of October 23rd, a small body of Americans stole across the Bronx River up to one of the tavern's outbuildings where washing was being done for the officers, and started to carry off 3 tubs of shirts when an alarm sounded. Dropping the tubs, they ran, but on their way back, they met another American patrol. They returned to the tavern and attacked once more. Colonel Tench Tillman wrote, "Our people drove them from the field and took possession of the house. They buried 10, brought in 2 prisoners, and a parcel of shirts," which was probably more important than anything to them. Now, the next house that we come to, of course, is the Ward House, which I'm sure we all know at the top of Winter Hill Road. Shortly after this, General Howe's headquarters were shifted from New Rochelle to the Ward House, where he remained for a week. All the official reports for the British Army were issued from here. The present Ward House still stands on the White Plains Road at the top of Winter Hill Road. It was rebuilt by Stephen Ward's son right after the close of the war from the same plans as the old house. I will tell you a little bit later that the British burned this house, and Stephen's son rebuilt it from the original plans. It is currently owned by Concordia College, of course. Stephen Ward was a great local patriot. He was a member of the Provisional Congress, a state senator, a member of Congress, and supervisor of the town of Eastchester during the Revolutionary War. As part of the neutral ground, this house saw action in the numerous skirmishes of the Revolutionary War. It was the command headquarters for the British General Howe in 1776, and in 1777, the headquarters for General Scott of the American forces. Such a troublesome spot was it considered by the British that in 1778, Major General William Tryon ordered it demolished and burned. Sometime before 1797, Jonathan Ward, son of Stephen, rebuilt the house using the original plans. During the 1830s, this was a tavern called Marble Hall, where the President Martin Van Buren was entertained at one time. Later, this house served as the first post office for the Tuckahoe-Bronxville area, and it was also a stop on the Red Bird stagecoach line. It was used, when Concordia first bought it, they used it as a dormitory. Now, this is the entrance that you see here, and to the right there is a very, very large room, and that was the original bar room of the tavern, and that's used as a meeting place and for seminars, and I believe if any of the public ever want to use it as a meeting place, I believe Concordia will still allow it. The bulk of the British Army then moved up Weaver Street into White Plains to fight the Battle of White Plains. Early in January of 1777, American General Morin Scott was now headquartered at the Ward House. From here, part of the troops crossed over Mile Square Road down into the Bronx to attempt the capture of Fort Independence on the Hudson. Failure in this, as well as the expiring enlistments of the militia and the resulting boldness of the Tories, so aroused the fears of the inhabitants that almost daily appeals for protection reached the state convention. The proximity of the British lines and the facility with which they could gather forage made raids for that purpose an almost daily occurrence. To remove this incentive, the American military authorities decided to destroy all the forage from New Rochelle, including Eastchester. Ward's house was chosen as the base from which the forage parties started and to which they returned. Now, this is a skirmish that was held here at the Ward House, and this is an eyewitness account that was made by one of the militiamen by the name of Devil. The British, on the evening of March 16, 1777, sent a strong detachment under Captain John Brendan and Archibald Campbell to surprise the Americans at the Ward House. And this is the account. I was at the attack made upon Ward's house by Major Campbell. In the morning of that day, the Americans, we went down to Williamsbridge on a scout to cover a foraging party consisted of 5 or 6 teams. Our intention being to forage in the vicinity of Morrisania and return to Eastchester and the Ward House in the evening. The enemy came up from Kingsbridge to oppose us, and we fought them across the Bronx River all day until the teams returned. We numbered about 80 strong, 40 accompanying the teams, while the rest remained to oppose the enemy. The British were about 50 strong and had a fort at Williamsbridge. It was night before we returned to Ward's house. Captain Samuel Delavan commanded us, and he was saved that night because he happened to have on a red coat, and so they thought he was a British officer. The enemy approached Ward's house from the west side of the road. A sentinel was posted near, or perhaps in the road, who challenged the British. The latter rushed up to the house and soon surrounded it. Captain Noah Boaton came to the door and asked for quarter, saying they were all desirous of surrendering. But Major Campbell called out, "Fire away, boys, kill all the damned rebels you can." Boaton thereupon discharged his musket and shot Campbell through the body, and he fell dead at his feet. There were about 200 Americans at the Ward House, who all escaped except 27 who were taken prisoners and 6 who were killed. I effected my escape by jumping out of a window on the north side of the house, and soon after encountered a company of Americans advancing. I gladly joined them and returned to the fight. On reaching the house, we found the enemy firing into the windows. Posting ourselves behind a stone wall, we attacked them, but they far outnumbered us, and outflanked, we were compelled to retreat. We retired that night some 2 miles off, and the next day returned and buried the dead at Ward's house. On the succeeding day, we retreated as far as North Castle, and about a week after were ordered to White Plains, where we remained until we were discharged. The dead who fell on this occasion were interred in a beautiful locust grove west of the Ward House and directly in the rear of the barn on the opposite side of the post road leading to White Plains. In other words, on the side of the road where Immaculate Conception Church is, right opposite the Ward House. The captain mentioned above who had charge of the foraging party was Captain Samuel Crawford of Scarsdale, and he was one of the ones who was killed at the skirmish at the Ward House. He had charge of the wagons in the expedition. And of course, this is his monument that stands directly across from the Ward House. The affair here had a very depressing effect on the people, as it showed that the enemy was able to raid the county at will. It's one of the reasons that houses of the period are so few in our area. Now, with the British temporarily halted at Pelham, the American detachment retreated on the night of October 18th across the Bronx River at Tuckahoe to join. Now, when we talk about this Tuckahoe, we're talking about Tuckahoe that we think of now as Crestwood and Colonial Heights. It's that area. To join Washington's army, which was laboriously making its way from Kingsbridge to White Plains along the Yonkers side of the Bronx River. In the absence of sufficient horses and wagons, the progress of the army was so slow over the narrow country roads that Washington himself never reached Valentine's Hill, which is the site now of St. Joseph Seminary in Yonkers, until the 21st, 3 days later. Imagine, to come just a few miles up from the Bronx. During this time, Washington was in doubt as to the location of White Plains. He was getting ready to fight the Battle of White Plains and had no idea where White Plains was. And so he sent out a scout by the name of Rufus Putnam on the 20th of October to try to ascertain where the place was. Putnam's account of this ride provides an interesting insight into the tireless bravery of the Americans. Setting out on the morning of the 20th from Cambridge, he arrived in Eastchester to find the village deserted and a small body of British near the church. He says, "I then disguised myself as an officer as far as I could and set out on the road to White Plains. However, I didn't know where White Plains was, nor where the road I had taken would carry me. After making a mistake and turning off what is today South Columbus Avenue, Mount Vernon, in the direction of New Rochelle, I learned that the British were at New Rochelle, and so I retraced my steps. On this information, I returned and pursued my route toward White Plains." In other words, then he came up the post road. And then he goes on to say, "The houses all the way were deserted until I came to within 3 or more miles of this place, Scarsdale. And I discovered a house a little ahead with men about it." Now this is what we know today as the Wayside Cottage in Scarsdale, but then it was known as the Varian House. By my glass I found that they were not British soldiers, and so I approached with caution. It was a tavern, by the way, at this time. From these men he learned that the British were at New Rochelle, also a detachment at Mamaroneck, and that there were 5 or 6 of the enemy's ships in the Hudson River. Having made these discoveries, I set out on my return. The road from Ward's house, so he came all the way down, retraced his steps. He came down to the top of Winter Hill Road again, and to Ward's house, and he went down past what is now Immaculate Conception Church, and past what is now the, on Main Street, you know, in Tuckahoe, the Marble Hotel, Sam Fee's home, and down this, he wouldn't have actually passed this, he would have passed in, this would have been to his left. This is the reason I put this in here, this is a kind of a nice old photo. On the end here, this is at the end of Lake Avenue. When you go down Main Street here in Tuckahoe and you turn left to go down Lake Avenue, this Young store, which was a general store, was at the end of the street. On the left is a house that is still standing. That house is not standing there. It was Mr. Stroh's house. And any of you who are as old as I am and went to Main Street School remember that Mr. Stroh was the custodian of Main Street School. And he and his wife lived in that house. That house has since been moved down on Armourvilla Avenue. You know where the gas station is on the corner? And the very first house is this house. Of course, it has been all done over so that you wouldn't recognize it. But this is that same house. And he would have, Putnam would have gone on his way, and he would have gone past here, which is, of course, the U.S. Vitamin. And this is the old mill that's connected with U.S. Vitamin, and this is a very good slide of the mill, a very good picture of it. Now this mill, by the way, is the second oldest cotton mill in the United States. I bet you didn't know that. The oldest cotton mill is in Providence, Rhode Island. And the Englishman who built the one in Providence, Rhode Island, stole the plans from a mill that he had worked in England. And he brought the plans over, and this mill, which is the second oldest mill, was built according to those plans. I have been in there, about a year ago, and they haven't done too much to the inside of it. Actually, all the old beams and so on are all there. However, they have divided the bottom floors into offices. But they really haven't ruined the old look of it, the old mill look. And upstairs is one tremendously large room, and at the time that I was there, they were using it for storage. So again, that was a room that had not really been touched. So this old mill is still pretty intact.
And where is this?
This is right across from the U.S. Vitamin. You know, across the Bronx River.
Okay.
The mill that's, you know, you have to go down the little side road.
Right.
When you come right across the bridge and you take a right turn going toward on Scarsdale Road. Now, he would have gone past all this, and then he would have gone up this way. Now here, he says he would go across the Bronx River and up what is now Scarsdale Road. And he was going this direction, provided that he didn't find any British along the way. Unfortunately, he didn't. But he did find Lord Stirling's division there, and it was after sunset at this particular point, and so he gave Lord Stirling an account of what had happened, and then he continued on his way. Now, he would have gone past, as I say, this, which is St. John's Church. And the reason I put this in the picture is because this is a historic church, and this is in the area that they called Tuckahoe at that time, but of course it's in the Crestwood Colonial Heights area. This is one of the first 3 churches built in what actually is the United States of America after it formally became so in 1789. From here, Putnam went down the Sawmill Road to Phillipsburg, which is now Yonkers, then down the Albany Post Road, which is now Broadway, to Kingsbridge and to General Washington's headquarters. And he arrived there at 9 o'clock at night. I found the general. I reported to him the discoveries I had made with a sketch of the county. He complained very feelingly of the gentleman from New York, from whom he had never been able to obtain a plan of the county, that their information that he had ordered the stores to White Plains as a place of security, and he had sent these up thinking that his stores were going to be secure up there, not knowing that the British were already up there. I had but a short time, Putnam says, to refresh myself and my horse when I received a letter from General Washington with orders to proceed immediately to Lord Stirling, and I arrived at his quarters about 2 o'clock in the morning. October the 21st, 1776, Lord Stirling's division marched before daylight, and we arrived at White Plains around 9 o'clock. And thus was the American army saved by an interposing providence from a probable total destruction. Now, one of the interesting things about this report is the poor information that Washington received all along the way, and if it weren't for scouts such as Putnam and these brave men who took it upon themselves to do this scouting during the war, things would have been in a much more serious condition than they would normally be in. In August, General Putnam sent a brigade to surprise the British post in the hospital St. Paul's. They took some prisoners and found some of the hospital stores so urgently needed by the Americans. But the brigade was soon forced to retreat. In this way, both the forces fought back and forth across the same lands, devastating our town beyond belief. By October, however, the season for campaigning was drawing to a close, and the British began preparation for withdrawing to their winter camp at Kingsbridge. When it was found that there was not sufficient huts for the men, Colonel Simcoe suggested to General Tryon that they take down Ward's house and the neighborhood buildings in Eastchester to obtain the necessary lumber. And they built their huts that they used for their winter home. What the army didn't use of the 50 loads they carted to the city they burned. With the passing of the British into winter quarters, the campaign in the county ended for the year 1777. And the area in the vicinity of New York City settled into comparative quiet, except for the forays of small bodies of bandits bent on robbery. The year of ever-present danger for the inhabitants, although their condition couldn't become much worse short of killing them. There were no public gatherings, either social, political, or religious, the interest of all being solely confined to self-preservation. Now, from then until 1783, with the official cessation of hostilities, the county was continuously ravaged by both the armies and by the guerrilla bands of cowboys and skinners. Almost every family left in the area had horrendous stories to tell of their sufferings at the hands of these despicable men. At the end of the war, these men were actually banished from communities, knowing that if they did return, they would immediately be killed. On May 20th, 1783, having been informed that the last British troops were withdrawing from Westchester, Governor George Clinton ordered Chief Justice Richard Morris to take possession of the county and to provide for the enforcement of the laws of the state and to establish a council for the temporary government of the southern parts of the state. After visiting Poughkeepsie, he established himself here at Guyan's Tavern. Now this is the marker for Guyan's Tavern. We do not have a picture of the house, but this is what the house looked like, Guyan's Tavern, which stood just a little bit below St. Paul's Church. General Washington had at one time stayed at this tavern. And of course, every place George Washington stayed, there has to be a story about him, right? Legend says that when George Washington left Guyan's Tavern, he kissed Mrs. Guyan on the cheek, and her husband was so impressed that he requested she never wash her face. We do know for a fact that Justice Morris stayed here at this tavern from May 20th to July 6, 1783. His bill for expenses, some 32 pounds, still exists in the official records of the state. The commissioners of sequestration, who had the hard task of disposing of Tory properties and adjust claims and damages, was composed of Stephen Ward from Eastchester, Samuel Drake, and Israel Honeywell, Jr. Nearly 350,000 fence rails had been seized. Over 3,000 cords of firewood used by the Army, as well as cattle and forage, had been taken. Two of the Tory properties that were confiscated and given to patriots were that of Edmund Ward and Andrew Fowler. Edmund Ward property, which still stands at the corner of Sirenoi Private Drive and Crawford Street. We call it the Tory House. Now this, of course, was Edmund Ward, who stayed on the side of the British during the war. And of course, all of their property was confiscated, and many of these people, including Edmund Ward and his family, went up to Canada to escape, because otherwise anything at all might have happened to them down here. This is the Tory House, and it's right at the entrance of the Sirenoi Country Club. There's a driveway between that house and the Cottle School, and this house is right here. And this house was given to David Williams, who was one of the captors of Major Andre. Now, David Williams never settled here, but he sold the land, much of which today, of course, is Bronxville Manor and the Sirenoi Country Club. We have followed the course of events now, for which more than 7 years made this quiet farming community the scene of a civil war that arrayed neighbor against neighbor, that divided families, and fed on the malevolence of the scoundrels and robbers who preyed on the suffering community. Taverns such as this, which was known as Crawford's Tavern during the Revolutionary War, and this tavern was directly across from St. Paul's Church. It was constantly used by both sides, depending upon who had control of the area at the time. The British would go to this tavern or the Americans. Legend has it that a British deserter was hung from a tree nearby. This tavern was originally built in 1732, and I'm very sorry to say that this tavern, of course, has since been torn down. However, our Eastchester Historical Society have a little bit of this tavern. We have some of the floorboards from this tavern on the floor of our marble schoolhouse. During the colonial times, when there were services down at St. Paul's Church, the minister used to change his clothes in this tavern. And also, church services in those days lasted all day, and the church was cold, of course, and the people had to have some kind of something to drink. And so during the intermission of the church services, they would go over to Crawford's Tavern. They would have something to drink and some refreshments. This is the marker. That marker is still there. Billy Crawford's Tavern, built in built in 1732. And that was put up by the Westchester. That was the Masonic Lodge, which met there. Now a territory in which life was not safe anymore. The modest homes along the White Plains Road gradually became vacant. Weeds and brambles grew in the field. In the highways, high grass obscured the wagon tracks. The first landing of the enemy in force was made in October 1776, and the last of the army left in May 1783. In those 7 years and 4 months, Westchester County and Eastchester was never free from the enemy. For every week and perhaps every day, it could furnish a record of bloodshed, either in open fight or misdeed or sneaking robbers. And the strain of consuming anxiety was never absent from this area. The people here fought longer and suffered more than any area in all the 13 colonies, and its fields, its hills, and its valleys are consecrated by their valor, their patriotism, and their suffering. And as we look today upon this simple marker in St. Paul's grave, where the bones of the soldiers who died at Tuckahoe are buried, we should all give thanks to the Lord for their long struggle, that we might live free today. And this is very near the grave of the Hessian soldiers. This is the grave of the American soldiers who died. I always have to end my program putting in a little pitch for our Eastchester Historical Society. This is our marble schoolhouse, and you know, we restored this, and our marble schoolhouse now is used just almost every single day in the week. I have charge of the educational program here. We have groups of school children who come down and spend a half a day or a day here. We have college groups who are taking courses in history, who are taking courses in education. We have a tremendous collection of 19th century children's literature, and I have college groups who are taking courses in children's literature who come down here. And we have well over 1,000 who visit our schoolhouse every single year. And that's a fact that we are very, very proud of. And of course, this is the library that we have built in back of the marble schoolhouse. It's open on Tuesday and Thursday from 2 to 4. It's a historical reference library if you're interested in, if you came from around this area and you're interested in your genealogy, we have a tremendous amount of information. We have all kinds of books on history. We have in here the records of the town of Eastchester that we transcribed. We have the records of St. Paul's Church, Eastchester, the burial records and the records of the church that we transcribed. We have here a costume collection. We have a map collection. And this is constantly used also by historians. And I thank you very kindly for allowing me to do this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schaffer. That was and you're
If you have any
very lucky
questions you'd like to ask,
to be here. Oh, yes, I should have that sure.
I don't know if I can answer them or not, but I'll try.
Where is that red house, or the red house?
You know where Eastchester High School is?
Yes.
All right.
Is it on Water Street?
Yes, it's right on the corner of Water and Stewart.
Oh, Water, okay.
Yeah, right on the corner.
That is the Stewart Place.
Stewart Place.
Not Stewart Avenue.
I'm sorry, Stewart Place, that's right, yeah.
Okay, then I know where.
Yeah. It's a lovely little house. I've been in it, and it really is. And Mrs. Donahue has really kept it looking, you know, the way it looked way back.
Madeline, what about the Riggs house up on,
The Riggs house, which is on the corner of Pondfield and Nearshell Road, which if you're going down toward Mount Vernon, it's on the left-hand side. There's a white picket fence around it. And that is a pre-Revolutionary War house also, of course, and that is the oldest house in Bronxville, and that house has a marker on it. And that's an interesting house. It's too bad we can't have a house tour again, I think, around. We had them some years back, but you know, nowadays people are leery of having house tours, afraid to have some people come in their house for fear that they might come back, you know, and rob and so on.
That house, to say, is on Almavilla. Is that Stroh's house?
Stroh's house.
Yeah, where was that originally?
It was where I showed you in the picture. It was on the, it was where the railroad is now.
Where?
On the side where the railroad is.
Oh, yes.
The downside of the railroad.
You kept referring to neutral
It was
ground.
moved.
Right.
I know that.
What was the neutral ground you kept on referring to?
The neutral ground was the territory, as I say. It extended all the way from what is now Co-op City. It extended over in Mamaroneck, Wilmont Road, over and around there, and then up.
Well, why was it neutral ground?
It was nothing. It was neutral ground because both the British and the Americans fought there constantly. It never fell in the hands of any group, and it was neutral all the way. Plus the fact, of course, that you had people there who, some of them were Tories and some were patriots.
Madeline? Madeline, how are you, dear? I want to compliment you, number one. Number two, is that red house where Patty of Seneca lived in?
No. His house is down further on Water Street. Yeah. His was that house on Water Street and those couple of houses there on Water Street are the houses of the quarry workers. They built those old houses.
That well that was inside that house.
And that house that he is referring to, which is on Water Street, it's about the third or fourth house on right-hand side on Water Street. And that house, in the dining room, it had a well underneath the house. My sister and her husband used to live there, and I know he always used to enjoy showing off. He'd lift up the piece of wood that was, on the top of it and show you the well, and you could actually see the well.
Was there any organized militia or continental force that originated in Eastchester?
Yes, we had one. Yeah, local militia.
What was the name of the unit? Was it to have
Just the local militia.
They
Yeah.
didn't name it after?
No. To my knowledge, no. Bob?
The Edward Ward house was part of the Ward plantation or the Ward farm or what?
Yes. Now that the house that he's talking about, you're talking about the one over at
I don't
Siwanoy.
know, yeah.
That whole, it's hard to believe, but you know where Rose Avenue is? Well, of course, there was no Rose Avenue. That was all Ward property. From the Ward house that's on the White Plains Road at the top of Winter Hill Road, extended all the way over. That was all Ward property, that whole
You never
thing.
went to Wackagill over towards the Wackagill Road? There wasn't there a Ward estate in there on the right-hand
Yes,
side?
but that's not the same family.
Not the same thing.
He was the Ward that was a politician in
The
Westchester
Baker,
County.
the Baker family, I believe,
Yeah,
too.
yeah. No, it had nothing to do with this Ward
No,
family.
no.
No.
Also, one quick question. Is that section up around Water Street, is that Sebastopol?
Basketball, that's right.
And what's the origin of that name? I've heard so many stories about it.
I don't really know.
I think Vinnie Buddy used to say that was because had so many, when the quarry workers were paid on Saturday night, they have...
You're right, because on the White Plains Road, there's that house that was a tavern,
Right in the corner.
right on the corner. It's really on the corner of, it's on the corner of Water Street.
The White Plains Road.
Yeah, and actually that house extends back, the Russo's house. It's a very large house, and that was a tavern at one time.
And they get in fights Saturday night.
And they would get in fights Saturday night there. See, the houses along there were the tavern, were the quarry workers' houses. And also for you people in Tuckahoe, up on River Street, of course, there are the quarry, those little houses up there that people live in now are also the houses of the quarry workers. Yes.
Was there any history of that Ward house that's still where it owns now during the Civil War?
Not that, no. I've never really heard anything about it.
We used to hear when we were kids that there were tunnels connecting that house.
Yeah, they always said that there was a tunnel going across the, underneath the White Plains Road, going over to that, the house that is owned also now by Concordia. And of course, there's a story about that house too, Dutch Schultz, big bootlegger. He lived in that house. Actually, his daughter went to Tuckahoe High School. Was in Harriet's class in Tuckahoe High School. Yes, in her class in Tuckahoe High School. And, for the while that they lived there. And of course, there was always talk that he kept, stuff underneath the tunnel, but no one has ever been able to find it. How about it, Mr. Deck? You probably heard about it too, right?
That's one of the first things we heard about when we moved to Eastchester.
That Schultz?
No, we heard that it was tunnels used for running for Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
And, see, she says it's true. And, but a historian,
But there actually, no one has ever found a tunnel. Now, in the Ward house, when you go into the Ward house, you go into a hallway. And at the end of that hallway, the last time I was in there, they had a telephone booth there. But underneath that was a way that you could go down into the cellar of the Ward House. And the cellar of the Ward House, like the cellar of the Marble Hotel here on Main Street, it's a dirt cellar, dirt and rock. And from this hallway, it was sort of a secret passage, and I have an idea that that's where they got the idea that there was something under, the White Plains Road. But actually, no one had, maybe it is, but no one has ever found it. And I know that a man who was a caretaker there after Concordia took it over, he did an awful lot of digging there. He really and truly did. And he had a group of Concordia students who did digging there, and no one ever found anything. It was supposed to be, if you know the house at all, there's a well in the back, and it's supposed to be by the well.
Now, where is that, on White Plains Road?
Right at the top of Winter Hill Road. Across from the crossing road. It doesn't face White Plains Road. What? I don't know what that's called. Winslow Circle. Yeah. It faces Winslow Circle. It's the very first house really on Winslow Circle.
I wanted to ask you, on Mill Road, there's a plaque, Bill of Rights Plaza. Is there any
Mill
history
Road.
behind, Mill Road, what did I say, Mill
I
Road?
thought you said Middle Road. That was
No,
why I-
Mill
Mill
Road.
Road, yeah.
What's the history behind that?
Well, you see, at St. Paul's Church, there was an election held there many, many years ago. And during that election, the Quakers, because the Quakers would not swear allegiance to anything, the Quakers were not allowed to vote. Peter Zenger, who was a newspaper man, wrote about this in his newspaper, which was printed in New York City. As a result of what he wrote in the newspaper, he was put on trial, Peter Zenger. As a result of his trial, he was found not guilty, of course. And as a result of that, we have freedom of the press. And this is Eastchester, remember, even though it's in Mount Vernon now, that's where that, and somebody called it.
Along Highland Avenue, there are a few very old, they look like revolutionary houses.
Those were some
too.
quarry workers, there are some
Yeah.
quarry workers'
There's one in
houses
particular
there.
so darling, I just love it in the middle of Highland, yeah.
Along that
That
road,
must
yeah.
be one of the old
Yeah,
houses.
yeah.
Madeline, can I ask you a question on that monument on Winter Hill Road in front of the Michael Conception School? What does that represent?
That was just Crawford's. It's called the Crawford Monument. And he was the one who, when they had that skirmish that I told you about at the Ward House, he was the one who had charge of the foraging party. And he was one of the ones who was killed. And since he came from Scarsdale, and since he was the one who had charge of the group at that time, this monument was erected.
Who put up this monument?
What?
Who put up the old monument?
I imagine probably the DAR. Did they, Mrs. Fraser? I think it's the same with those two, the Hessian's grave and the American, the tombstones at St. Paul. They were put up by the DAR, and I only found that out recently when I was down there because I read it on it. Any other?
Captain Crawford Town is still standing in Scarsdale, and I always forget whether it's on Butler Road or one of those others that, I don't know what street number it is anyway, but it is one of the old houses in Scarsdale. Are there any more questions for Mrs. Schaffer? Well, if you think of any after you leave, come back on the 19th. We'll have many people here.